Welcome back to Historical Horrors. My name is Christy Clark, and today we're going to be talking about the Historic Davenport Hotel. If you're new to the podcast, I usually will start with the history of the building first before moving into the paranormal, because often, since I'm doing local stories, there aren't very many paranormal investigations to really pull research from. So before we get into the spooky part of the podcast, let's talk about the history of the Davenport Hotel. So the history of the hotel actually predates Washington becoming a state. The creator of the Davenport, Louis Davenport, came to the territory of Washington in the spring of 1889. He came to Spokane Falls, which would later be called Spokane Washington. So Davenport comes to Spokane Falls to work at his uncle's restaurant. Unfortunately, by the end of the summer, most of the town was burnt down by this massive fire that took out a lot of the city. Louis took the opportunity to rebuild and start his own business instead of working under his uncle. He purchased a tent and opened Davenport's Waffle Foundry. He eventually expanded and moved into a building where his business continued to be extremely successful. He eventually would absorb two of the buildings that were next to the restaurant, which was in collaboration with some local businessmen. So it was a group of prominent members of the city. They came together, gave Davenport some money to absorb these buildings. The businessmen also hired architect Kirtland Cutter to camouflage the newly absorbed buildings and make the Davenport Waffle Foundry look as if it was one complete building. So this expansion, or this fusing of buildings, added the ballroom aspect of the hotel, but it wasn't actually a hotel until 1912 is when it was starting to be built. In 1914, the Davenport Hotel was completely built and ready to go. The Davenport was an extremely, state-of-the-art hotel. It was the first in the United States to have air conditioning, a central vacuum system, pipe organ, and dividing doors in the ballroom. The hotel also housed the first radio station in Spokane in 1922, which, fun fact, features a young Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby, I believe, went to Gonzaga University, which is in Spokane. I believe he also created a local band, and that band was played on the radio station. Now, the Davenport Hotel, even to this day, is considered to be this extremely luxurious and beautiful hotel. But the hotel wasn't always this prestigious. In 1945, Davenport sold the hotel, but he continued to live there under the new owners until his death in 1951. Davenport did die in the hotel, and so did his wife. A few years later, in 1967, his wife died in the same room. So the hotel is being run by new owners. Eventually, it is added to the National Register of Historic Places on September 5th, 1975, but in the 80s, the Davenport actually closed. In 1985, the Davenport officially closed its doors and it was going to be demolished. The only reason the demolition was delayed was because it was deemed too expensive to demolish it. There was also a very concerning health risk, because when the Davenport would be demolished, all of this asbestos would fly into the air and become airborne, so there was a health risk to the city. So the building was left untouched for 15 years. In the year 2000, the property was saved by the Worthies. They spent millions of dollars to restore the building, and now it continues to be open to this day under the new name, the Historic Davenport Hotel. So that was a quick and dirty history of the Davenport Hotel. Now we can move on to the paranormal aspects of the hotel. So the typical findings are orbs and disembodied voices. You have the normal footsteps, but you also have these central characters. The first very famous ghost from the hotel is Mrs. Ellen McNamara. Reportings of Mrs. Ellen McNamara, that's going to be really, really hard to say, so I might just call her Ellen. So reportings of Ellen really started after the Davenport reopened in July of 2002. Guests started reporting that there was a woman that was lost in the lobby. Now, this scenario is actually brought to us by Meg Harper, who's the hotel's director of sales. She says that the woman was dressed in a white gown and shawl that didn't seem to be of this era. She thought that it was more of 1920s garb. Now, Meg Harper says that the guests were apparently asked by this woman, "Where did I go?" Now, I thought this was pretty creepy, but there is actually a newspaper article from August 17th of 1920 that there was a woman who died in the hotel and her last words were, "Where did I go?" As you may have inferred, this woman's name is Ellen McNamara. So the story behind her is that apparently she was wandering around the hotel before or during a dinner. She was with some friends and she wasn't feeling very well, so she went on a little walk. She somehow was able to access a door that led to the lobby's glass skylights, and she walked on them, and the glass gave way and she fell 30 feet to her eventual death. She didn't die on impact. She was actually able to say, "Where did I go?" And I believe they moved her from the floor to a couch where she did eventually pass. Now, this is an actual quote from the article that was published on her death. It's an unnamed reporter, but this is from the 1920s article. Witnesses of the fall said the woman's shoulder struck the floor first and that her head crashed against the stone. Perhaps 100 persons saw her fall. Several men rushed to her and carried her to a couch. She was conscious for a few seconds and asked, "Where did I go?" before she became insensible. Ellen, I believe, is one of the most prominent ghosts that you do see at the hotel. A lot of people will see or report a woman in 1920s garb, as we previously established, and she will be carrying shopping bags. She'll be kind of wandering around. Another ghost that wanders around the hotel is Louis Davenport himself. So Davenport is reported to haunt the hallways in his robe and slippers in the middle of the night. Mr. Davenport likes to keep up with the hotel and often talks to staff members. And when he's in his robe and slippers in the middle of the night, he's usually checking on guests. So he's a very friendly ghost. Ellen McNamara is also friendly. I don't think that there's really any malevolent spirits here. I think all of them reported have been pretty nice. Here's a few stories that I collected of Davenport. So a few years ago, the same lady, Meg Harper, she said that dining staff were setting the places for a big banquet that they were having, and they had a bunch of the silverware lined up to the edges of the table. Person setting up the silverware left and then came back to the room, and all of the silverware was perfectly moved one knuckle in from the edge. And that was apparently a standard insisted upon Mr. Davenport to keep guests from knocking the silverware off the table. Another story that is believed to be about Mr. Davenport is that the hotel's florist was in the basement around 2 a.m. She started to feel like cigar smoke was being blown in her face, and she was talking to her colleagues about it, and they gave her a smoke test to find the cigar that created the smell. She picked the Roy Tan, which is the brand that Mr. Davenport smoked. Mr. Davenport loved his hotel so much, and it was reported that when he died, he said that he never wanted to leave, and he didn't. He died in his room in the hotel, and that is Suite 1105. I believe that you could stay there to this day. So if you want to check out Suite 1105, go for it. Let me know of any experiences that you have in that room. Be very interested to hear. Unexplainable events that have happened in that room was that during renovations, there was this wiring that blew back and forth in the breeze, but there was no breeze. So they were just kind of moving on their own. And then in that room, the renovators would hear party clackers, and they were like, that's weird, because why would there be party clackers? But they made an educated guess that it's because the first party at the Davenport was a New Year's Eve party, which clackers are very prominent when, the countdown goes down and we get to 1 and it's just everyone makes a bunch of noise. Other reportings from Suite 1105 is hotel guests will have their items being moved and they'll just hear some strange noises, some bumps in the night. Now, like I said, these ghosts are known for being very nice, and Mr. Davenport usually appears when a guest needs help. I always love those haunted hotel stories where a guest needs help and a ghost will come and help them. And then when they run into one of the staff members, they're like, "Oh, thank you so much for sending someone up to help me." And the staff members will be like, "What are you talking about? We didn't send anyone up. We were busy downstairs." And the hotel guest would be like, well, like, she was kind of dressed like this, and it was like this lady, and it's no one. It's like one of the old workers that hasn't left. I think those stories are really fascinating and cool. There is one more prominent ghost that haunts the Davenport Hotel, and his name is Vachel Lindsay. You may have heard that name before. He is a pretty famous poet. He also has a fairly strong attachment to the Davenport. He lived there from 1924 to 1929. He was married in his suite, suite number 1129, if you're curious. He started his family there. He was the proclaimed artist in residence because Mr. Davenport thought that that's what hotels had to have. They had to have an artist in residence to be considered like a top-tier hotel. If you aren't familiar with Lindsay's work, he did one of his famous poems is The Congo. I believe his poetry is famous because it has something to do with like music. Now, I don't know the actual terminology for this, but he uses his words and kind of creates a cadence, and that's what made him stand out as a poet. His work is also heavily racist, so just be aware of that when you're reading it, that some of it has some pretty heavy content. He was also referenced in Dead Poets Society, that movie. I believe Robin Williams is in it. I have not seen it, so he is referenced in that. I pulled that offline. So at first, Davenport was really excited to have an artist in residence, and then Vachel started getting very weird. I read online that he used to bring 2 large dolls to sit with him at dinner, and he would talk to them, and it's so eerie. Imagine, like, you're sitting at this extremely nice, beautiful hotel, and then all of a sudden some dude brings in, like, 2 dolls and, like, sits them at the table and starts having dinner with them. So Davenport was like, okay, you need to leave, like, you're making guests uncomfortable. So he did leave, but he wasn't alive for very long after he left. He just went downhill, and he had a depressive episode. He left for his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, and either when he arrived or somewhere on the way, he drank a whole bottle of Lysol, and his last words were, "They tried to get me, I got them first." Thankfully, Vachel Lindsay is not that prominent of a ghost. He's just one of them, but he doesn't really interact with people very often, so you don't have to be scared of him. He's not very present. Oh, and there is one more story of another ghost. He is apparently a bellman. You're not supposed to see him, but if you're working, he'll like open and close the door for you. And then he'll also help you with heavy objects up or down the stairs. So you'll be carrying this really heavy object, and then all of a sudden it just gets lighter. So he's a pretty friendly ghost. I wouldn't mind having him around. I have just a few more fun stories that also kind of tie in with history a little bit. So Louis Davenport, he built a jazz nightclub on the first floor of the Davenport. He thought that it was going to be this incredible nightclub. It was going to be the best of all time. And then the Prohibition happened, and he had to basically stop his nightclub, but he didn't. He just relocated the nightclub to the basement, and he operated a speakeasy in the Davenport. It was called the Early Bird Club, and it ran for 19 years. When the Prohibition was over, Davenport memorialized some of the parts of the club by putting some of the original dance floor and parts of the speakeasy in now what is called the Early Bird Ballroom. Now, the paranormal aspect of this story is now you can hear jazz and laughter in an empty ballroom, and sometimes you even see a man in a tux walking to guard the ballroom, even though he's not actually there. Now, this last story I actually found on TripAdvisor. I scrolled through a bunch of the reviews. I filtered through, I used the search term ghost to try and filter through some of the reviews, and I stumbled across this story, so I'm going to just read it to you. We had a visitation on our first night in the Davenport suite on the 14th floor, which we all know is really the 13th floor. At 4:30 a.m., we had the presence of a very angry man standing near the large windows screaming some colorful language at us, which was a bit too bawdy to share on here. He made a shadowy pass by the bathroom large window and was gone. Jolting as it was, it did not upset our stay, and we were intrigued to see if he would return on our second night. He did not. Now, first off, why? Why are you intrigued to see if he's going to come back? If a ghost is screaming, not even just a ghost, if you just wake up and there's a man in the middle of your room and he's screaming at you, I would not want to wait to see if he comes back the second night. I would be out of there. But that's just me. I'm kind of a scaredy cat. And I don't think that you should want that to happen the next night, But some people do come to the Davenport for the paranormal aspect of it. It is, I believe, on a haunted tour of Spokane. So a lot of people do know that it is a paranormal site and believe that it is actually haunted. But there are also a lot of people that just stay because it's a beautiful historic hotel. So you kind of have both sides of it, the history and the paranormal. I personally have not stayed at the Davenport. I would love to. I believe it's probably in my future to stay at the Davenport. So when I do stay at the Davenport, I should revisit this episode and create some kind of content to show you if anything happens or if I find anything or interview one of the hotel employees. I'm gonna work on some side content for you guys, maybe a Patreon thing. I'm looking into Patreon just to explore that option, try and make new content, but I need support to make that content. So if you want to donate, I'll have a link in the show notes that you can donate to my Patreon. I also have an Instagram at historicalhpod and a Twitter at the same handle at historicalhpod. There's also a Facebook page for this podcast, and you can find it at Historical Horrors. Please feel free to message me if you're from the Pacific Northwest, if you have any local haunted places that you'd like me to research and talk about. I would love to have suggestions from you guys. If you have any personal stories of haunted happenings in the Pacific Northwest, please let me know, or really anywhere. Eventually, the plan is to branch out and start doing things that are outside of the Pacific Northwest, but as for now, I would like to continue with local stories because I think that they're just very under-discussed and they are just as fun as talking about the Winchester House or, Salem witch trials, different things like that. So I think local stories are just as important. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Tune in next week for another Historical Horrors episode.